Hello and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1947, the 51st season of the VFL, and it was the City of Melbourne's 100th anniversary. While that was an anniversary worth noting, it was also a time to look forward, as Australia established a rocket research facility at Woomera. Within a year, there was a local footy competition established, with kicks flying high while rockets took off. 1947 was also the start of the post-war immigration boom, with the initial focus on immigrants from the UK. In January, a contingent of young men sailed into Sydney Harbour on the Largs Bay, a ship that had also been used a couple of years before to bring Australian prisoners of war home from Singapore. If you listened to that 1945 episode, you would recall Peter Chitty listening to his brother Bob playing in the preliminary final that year, until the captain turned the game off, thinking it was too exciting for the recovering former POWs. Now, that same ship was bringing in the first immigrant of builder migrants. Greeted at the wharf by the Prime Minister, Ben Chifley, and the Immigration Minister, they were sent to Canberra to start building houses, which were in short supply. By 1947, over 400,000 Britons had registered for assisted travel. Many of these would become the famous £10 POMs. Other boatloads arrived from Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. With their blonde hair and blue eyes, these were known as the beautiful Bolts. The wave of immigrants would build in the years to come, providing many new recruits for VFL clubs, as well as driving Australia's economy and creating our modern multicultural society. In international news, both India and Pakistan gained their independence from Britain amidst devastating turmoil and the loss of life as millions moved from one newly born country to the other. Europe was struggling in the aftermath of the war. The British food ration fell below what was deemed required to keep an unemployed worker healthy. Bread was rationed for the first time, something that had not even happened during the war. Britain was trying to feed its own population, support people in the devastated parts of Germany, and still maintain armed forces around the world. The strain was coming at a cost for those at home. France was beset by strikes, disruptions to gas and water supply, and fears of a coup or a civil war. There was no shortage of weapons floating around if you wanted them. Italy was also gripped by strikes and communist-led attacks on police forces, with ammunition dumps being blown up. Germany was largely rubble. 40% of housing stock was damaged. 90% of rail lines were inoperable. The war was over. The peace was yet to be won. A total economic collapse was more than possible. George Marshall had been the US Army Chief of Staff, the man Winston Churchill described as the organiser of victory. In 1947, he was the American Secretary of State, responsible for the US foreign policy and relations with the wider world. At a Harvard Commencement Day speech in January 1947, he outlined Europe's dire economic condition, a post-war dystopia, dysfunctional and vulnerable. He declared it could not go on. Action was required. From that speech would grow what would become known as the Marshall Plan, a scheme where the United States and Europe cooperated to create a road to recovery. From 1947 until the end of 1951, the US provided $13 billion in aid, which is more than US $100 billion in today's money. The leaders in Western Europe were desperate for the finance to kickstart their countries' economies after the devastation of the war. However, in a sign of things to come, Eastern European countries under the influence of the Soviet Union did not participate in the scheme. With all that economic chaos and the ongoing turmoil after the war, you can see why faraway Australia was seen as an attractive destination for those looking to start a new life. 1947 was also the year that the United Nations voted to divide the Palestinian territory between Palestinians and Jews, which would lead to the State of Israel and numerous conflicts which are still unresolved. An Australian Football League peace team initiative to provide the neutral sport of Australian rules did play several games between Palestinians and Israelis from 2008 to 2011, with Robert Di Domenico and Ron Barassi and others involved. But footy cannot solve everything. A critical piece of technology was demonstrated in 1947 that would eventually bring joy to many as they followed their team on portable radio broadcasts. The transistor, invented at the Bell Labs, was shown publicly for the first time in December 1947. Transistors would, in time, replace fragile valves in radios, making them smaller, more portable, and able to run on batteries, bringing football broadcasts to many more people wherever they were. Also, fundamental to the way we enjoy our footy was the launch of the 4 and 20 meat pie in Bendigo in 1947. At first, baker Thompson McClure called them Dad and Dave pies, after the name of his cafe, but an employee suggested the famous name based on the nursery rhyme. Initial production was about 50 pies per day, but by the early 1950s, production had moved to a factory in Kensington, and there was plenty of pies baked every day. Food outlets in modern stadiums do offer plenty of alternatives, but a meat pie just might be what you need at the footy. The first commercial microwave oven also made its debut in 1947, and plenty of pies have been heated up in microwave ovens ever since, but they never taste quite right. One final non-footy sporting highlight was the resumption of the Sheffield Shield in the summer of 1946 and 47, the first time it had been played since 1940. Victoria won the Shield, with St Kilda Football Club's Keith Miller leading the run scoring and Footscray footballer George Tribe taking the most wickets. We're not going to see that again in our modern sporting world. Sadly for both clubs, neither Miller nor Tribe would continue their VFL careers. Keith Miller moved to Sydney and George Tribe went to England to play professional cricket for many, many seasons. Let's have a look at the footy now. The eternal quest for international games for Australian footballers was once again in the news in January 1947, with the VFL secretary, like McBrien, discussing a proposal for 2 Australian teams to visit Ireland to demonstrate the Australian code, with 2 Irish teams to come to Australia to play Gaelic football. It would not happen in 1947, but only 20 years later, VFL umpire Harry Beitzel would arrange an unofficial series of games, with the first official international rules games occurring in 1984. Ireland was not the only potential international destination, with an American leading the charge this time. Carl Delmuth was the athletic director at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, and he travelled to Australia to learn more about our local code after being entertained with stories of the game by returning American servicemen. He visited without drawing attention to himself and spent 4 weeks watching the game, researching and having the freedom to see it from all angles. He was converted and set up games of Australian football upon his return with the intention of developing competition between colleges on the East Coast. Sadly, it never moved beyond those early stages. Another perennial topic raised in March of 1947 was the call by former Collingwood player, administrator and Sporting Globe journalist Bruce Andrew to replace the VFL delegates with an independent board of directors. While not criticising the individual delegates, he identified the obvious conflict of interest in running a league versus protecting each club's own agenda. It had been raised as early as 1934, and it would finally occur in 1985, with a full switch in 1993. If only the VFL delegates had listened, it could have happened decades earlier. 1947 would also see the last 2 homecomings after the disruptions of the war. South Melbourne would play their home games at the Lakeside Oval, no longer having to share the Junction Oval with St Kilda. The VFL would also move back home to Harrison House, leaving their temporary accommodation at Anzac House. Meanwhile, the ongoing tensions between the VFL and the VFA continued this year, as we have discussed in previous episodes. Not much was resolved, but the VFA did introduce another new law that we take for granted in the game now, prohibiting kicking in danger. It was intended to give players confidence to go for the ball without the fear of a boot taking them out. I spoke earlier about the difficult times in the UK and the challenges they faced in ongoing rationing of food. Now, rationing was still in place in Australia, but it was nowhere near as severe, and there were many efforts to support the people in Britain. As part of that campaign, a unique football competition was held, which was also a signpost of what would come in the future. South Melbourne Football Club decided to host a women's football game on Sunday, July 6, after round 12. They put one ad in the paper and then were inundated with applicants. Amongst the enthusiastic candidates were a Mrs. C. Curtin, the wife of the St Kilda player Jack Curtin, and a 15-year-old schoolgirl, Gladys Phillips, who was playing with the men's social team and knew enough about the game to be able to use her shoulders and hips like a man and go through a pack like Jack Dyer. Gladys Phillips would go on to represent Australia in both cricket and softball, captaining the Australian softball team to a World Championship in 1965. There were so many applications for this women's football game, the Swans switched from a single game to a lightning premiership with help from St Kilda, Carlton and Footscray. The event was front-page news, with pictures and stories as the women prepared for the big game. A crowd of 25,000 people turned up to support the women and the fundraising. South Melbourne coach Bull Adams umpired the games, while other league stars took part in a kicking competition during breaks between the matches. The day raised over £650, or about $45,000 in today's money, and gave many women a taste of playing footy for the first time. Sadly, the enthusiasm shown by the women was not supported for ongoing women's football. That would require many more years of work. There is a colour video of the game on the AFL website with more details of the matches. I'll put a link up in the show notes. There are only 2 new coaches appointed in 1947. These post-war years were a rare period of coaching stability. Hawthorn's committee decided that they needed a playing coach and replaced Keith Shea with Rover Alec Albertson, twice club best and fairest, 4 times their leading goal kicker. He impressed the committee with his ability to address the players and his knowledge of football tactics. He had spent time coaching some junior teams while playing at Hawthorn, adding to his experience. Spoiler alert. The Hawks would continue to struggle, and the lack of any budget for recruiting would continue to limit the club's opportunities for success. Alec would coach for 3 seasons, and his replacement in 1950 would generate one of the most unpleasant splits ever seen at Hawthorn. More on that in a future episode. The other coaching change was at Footscray, where that committee decided they wanted a non-playing coach, so captain coach Arthur Oliver was replaced by Jim Crowe. Oliver was not happy, given that in his 4 seasons in charge, the Bulldogs had made the finals twice, and he spent much of the pre-season looking at other options, including the coaching job at Hawthorn, and he was seen at one of Richmond's training sessions. Jim Crowe played with Carlton between 1929 to 1934, then spent a season as captain coach of Carlton's reserves team, before moving to Collingwood to resume his senior playing career in 1936. He played in the Collingwood premiership team that season and managed another 8 games in 1937 for a total of 104 VFL games. He'd also been the playing coach of the Footscray Seconds until war service in the Army took priority. By mid-March, Arthur Oliver had decided to resume his playing career at Footscray, saying that his future was tied up with his sports store business in Footscray, so he would remain with the old club. However, he was replaced as captain by centreman and 3-time best and fairest Harry Hickey for this season. Reigning premiership coach Dick Reynolds also had some changes in his life. He opened a new furniture store in Mount Alexander Road, Moonee Ponds, Being his own boss would provide more flexibility for his coaching commitments. Reynolds also began writing for the Argus, following the example of Jack Dyer, who had begun a column with The Sun in 1946. Media opportunities for big VFL stars were expanding. Reynolds actually had to get the paper each week to see what he had written. He would go into the Argus office each week and have a conversation about footy. His articles were then ghostwritten by Ron Carter, who would go on to be the head of football for The Age and a celebrated athletic and Olympic specialist. As a young journalist, he had paid his own way to the 1952 Helsinki Olympics, and he covered every Summer Olympics up to Barcelona in 1992 before he retired in 1993. His ability to break confidential football stories so frustrated league officials, they developed a plan to find his source. In a special briefing paper for moving a team to Sydney, they sent separate documents to each VFL club, with a key figure changed in each version. The story, of course, was in The Age the next day, and the incriminating figure was North Melbourne's. North had been Ron's source this time, but he had plenty more. He was an outstanding journalist. Now, back to 1947. Another young footballer was featured in a small article that was published in the Castlemaine Mail in 1947. Headlined, Another Barassi, it described 11-year-old Ron Barassi's success in creating a new under-12 broad jump record and equaling the under-12 high jump record. The author of the article, who referenced Ron's dad, suggested that the younger Ron's name might be mentioned in football circles in about 6 years, which was a pretty fair tip. The season would again, like 1946, go for 19 rounds, the traditional 18 rounds plus one, all revenue from that extra game going into the Players' Provident Fund that had been set up in 1946. Nothing controversial about that, is there? Round 1 was eagerly anticipated. Essendon unfurled their premiership flag at Windy Hill in front of South Melbourne and opened the season with a comfortable win. In fact, the only close game was between last year's runners-up, Melbourne, and 1945 premiers, Carlton, who had missed the finals in 1946. Carlton held off a strong comeback by Melbourne in the last quarter to win by 13 points. The Blues were looking to get back to the top and shocked their supporters and the wider football world by appointing Western Australian Ern Henfrey as captain, despite the fact he had only played 2 games for the Blues in 1944 while in Melbourne with the RAAF. Henfrey had moved to Melbourne after the war and tried to get a clearance from Perth in 1946, without success, even with that expensive 3-way telephone hookup in July 1946. Henfrey stood out of football altogether, but continued to train with Carlton. His clearance finally came through in March after a further appeal. The National Football Council decided that, as he had lived in Melbourne for more than 12 months, there was no reason to block the clearance. Carlton wanted his skills and leadership, and with Bob Chitty retiring after the 1946 season, the Blues wasted no time giving Henfrey the captaincy. Round 2 saw Melbourne win their game against Geelong at the MCG, but only after kicking 13 behinds in a row before scoring their first goal. Round 6 saw an unbelievable turnaround in a game that should have been Essendon's. The Bombers were 44 points up at three-quarter time, but failed to score in the last quarter. The ball hardly went into their forward line at all, as North Melbourne, on the bottom of the ladder going into this round, went on a rampage, kicking 8 goals for in the final quarter to knock off 6th place Essendon by 8 points. It was a big night at Arden Street that week. Football at any level can be dangerous at times, and round 5 saw a couple of unusual injuries beyond the normal pulled muscles and corked thighs. Carlton had a big win at Essendon, but the Blues full forward, Ken Hands, received a slight concussion, not from another player, but when he was hit on the head by a bottle that fell from the Essendon grandstand. Unlike some other incidents where players had been hit by bottles, it seemed this was an accident while some boys were collecting bottles. Richmond's Laurie Taylor was making his first appearance for the Tigers since 1944, when he was based in Melbourne during the war. The South Australian was looking to make a big impression. At the opening bounce, He knocked the ball 40 yards into the forward line. A great hit out, but he'd also dislocated his shoulder and spent the rest of the game on the bench and missed the next game. After round 6, the season was 1/3 complete. Carlton and Footscray had started the season well, both sitting on 5 wins. The Blues on top with the better percentage. Fitzroy, Collingwood and Melbourne followed on 4 wins. Reigning premiers Essendon, sitting in 6th spot, had started slowly with just 3 wins in 6 games. Then a big group of clubs who had just picked up 2 wins, starting with Geelong, who had shown better form than recent seasons when they'd struggled to win 2 games all year. Behind them were South, Richmond, Hawthorn and North, and in last spot on just 1 win, St Kilda. Round 7 had a bit of everything. All the games were close, with the largest margin just 19 points when top-of-the-ladder Carlton managed to get away from second-last North Melbourne in the last quarter, with a Carlton player saying it was the hardest game they'd played so far. Richmond pipped Collingwood by a point, and the other 4 games were decided by 2 goals or less. Fittingly, this was all happening in front of a record 132,607 people, the most people to watch a round of football in 51 seasons of the VFL, confirming, yet again, the boom in the post-war popularity of football. The game between 5th place Melbourne and 2nd from the top Footscray created headlines in the week after the close-fought match that saw the Demons win by just 7 points. A Footscray trainer was reported by the field umpire for offering a bribe of £5 if Footscray won, because he had a £10 bet on the game. The trainer repeated the offer 3/4 time, approaching umpire Ellison, holding up 5 fingers and saying, "It's still on." The trainer claimed he'd said it as a joke, but that defence did not help, and he was barred for life from holding any position with any club aligned with the VFL. The League Investigation Committee cleared Footscray of any involvement. That alone was enough to draw attention to the game, but there was more. 2 Footscray players reported to their club that they had been offered bribes to withdraw or play dead. Footscray secretary Roy Russell declared they knew who had offered the bribes and there was no connection to the Melbourne Football Club. There was talk of an investigation, but it all seemed to go nowhere. Gambling in football has always been a problem. Those of us who have been following the footy for a while will recall the years where big games at suburban grounds began to be switched to the MCG or VFL Park. That was a time of change and a signal that the era of traditional home grounds would give way to the larger stadiums that could fit more supporters in significantly more comfort. It was a logical thing to do from a professional sports management perspective, but it was a difficult transition for those focused on the heritage and emotions, not to mention the home ground advantage of the traditional suburban grounds. Way back in 1947, the league delegates were testing that authority to command a switch of venue. They demanded the round 9 Collingwood-Carlton game, due to be played at Victoria Park on the Monday of the King's birthday split round, be played at the MCG, to the horror of Collingwood and their supporters. The issue was not about better facilities, or the opportunity for more people to see the game in the best stadium in the country, which would otherwise be empty. But it was about money. The split round had been designated as the fundraiser for the Players' Provident Fund, building up that collective nest egg to provide payouts to retiring players who had met qualifying conditions in terms of years of service, etc. However, the Collingwood City Council, who controlled Victoria Park, were not happy about the league imposing this condition. The council were not against the Provident Fund, but arrangements on divisions of revenue had to be negotiated, not mandated by the league. The council had to protect the ratepayers and not just do what the league said. There was talk of Collingwood refusing to play at the MCG, a forfeit that risked them being suspended from the league. Supporters reading their Wednesday morning newspapers were told that the Collingwood committee had met, but no comment was provided on whether the club would play on the following Monday. It was an extraordinary standoff between the league and arguably its biggest club. All day in factories, shops, schools and workplaces, and on the streets of Collingwood, conversations were focused on what was going to happen to their club. Would they play at the MCG or forfeit? The League Match Committee met for 3 hours that Wednesday night before the game, with all discussions behind closed doors. Collingwood's delegate outlined the club's resolution and was then called back in twice before the match committee announced its decision. The game would proceed at Victoria Park, with the assurance of the Collingwood president that the proceeds for the Provident Fund would be available as required by the league. The crisis was averted. Collingwood kept its home ground advantage, and the arguments about the league switching games mid-season would be held off for several decades. The Magpies won the game easily, inflicting Carlton's second loss for the season. The workaround was that Collingwood paid the equivalent amount of money to the league from their reserves, and the council provided Collingwood an additional share of gate takings over the remaining games to match that amount. The Provident Fund got the money the league wanted, Collingwood got their home game, and the Collingwood Council provided the funds in a way that satisfied them, rather than being dictated to by the high-handed VFL. Honour was satisfied all around. The Collingwood City Council attitude to the league directives was also on display in July, when the VFL requested that the officers of the visiting British Royal Navy fleet be admitted free to the grandstand enclosure, and that sailors be admitted free to the outer. When this was brought up at the Collingwood Council meeting, Councillor Angus said that the proposal was what one could expect from, quote, such a plutocratic body as the League, end quote. He moved that the officers and the men from the Royal Navy Fleet be welcome at Victoria Park at any enclosure they chose. Councillor Talwer replied, quite right, there is no class distinction here, and the motion was carried unanimously. And we can expect the frosty relationship between the League and the Collingwood City Council to continue. Whether there is still no class distinction at Collingwood home games is beyond the remit of this podcast. Round 10 provided a difficult day for footy tippers. Every away club won, which would be good if you forgot to put your tips in and you got the away teams as the default. It would not happen again until 1978. Round 10 also saw tensions rise between Footscray and Richmond after the Bulldogs won at Punt Road. It was alleged that the Footscray coach, Jim Crow, said that a certain Richmond player should be dealt with. The report in The Sun went on to claim that Crow, in his scathing criticism of the player, said Footscray players were entitled to get on his blind side and deal with him, adding, kicking would not be too good for him, which was extraordinary given the general condemnation of deliberate kicking of opponents. Crow responded to the reports, saying his instructions to his team were, despite the provocations offered by Richmond players, they should concentrate on the ball and use their speed to get out of trouble. As for that kicking quote, he was just telling his players not to descend to such tactics and get themselves into trouble. By round 12, the season was 2/3 done, and the ladder had changed shape. Carlton had kept top spot with 10 wins, followed by Collingwood and an improved Essendon, both on 8 wins. And then a queue of 3 clubs 1 game behind, Melbourne, Fitzroy out of the 4, and Richmond. Footscray's early season form had dropped away. After winning 4 of the first 6 games, they only had that win against Richmond and a draw against bottom-of-the-table St Kilda, leaving the Bulldogs 7th on the ladder, needing to get out of the slump if they were going to make finals. Then South and Geelong on 4 wins. Disappointing for the 1945 grand finalists in their first season home after 5 years away, but encouraging for the Cats, who were moving off the bottom of the ladder. Hawthorn was 10th on 3 wins, followed by North on 2 wins and St Kilda last with just 1 win and a draw. Round 12 was also a very sad day for Collingwood supporters and for football supporters in general. The Magpie champion, Des Fothergill, ended his career only being able to manage 4 games this season after injuring his knee late in the 1946 season. Fothergill played a total of 111 games, kicked 337 goals, won a Brownlow, 3 Copeland trophies, and he was not yet 27. He was selected on the half-forward flank for the Collingwood Team of the Century, and we can only wonder what he might have achieved in a career not disrupted by a VFA detour, war service and injury. Besides his football career, he also played cricket, representing Victoria 27 times with a first-class average of 39, including a century against South Australia, one of the small number of players to represent their state at both football and cricket. He was inducted into the Australian Football Hall of Fame in 2000. In round 14, Geelong were threatening to upset Collingwood at Victoria Park when Magpie fullback Jack Green was trying to blanket Geelong forward Lindsay White, and he ended up knocking over the behind post. The game was stopped, and while the crowd jeered, the players and umpires did their best to put the post back up. It stayed more or less in place until the last quarter, when it toppled over again, while Geelong were bombarding the goals. All was confusion. Could the game continue with the missing behind post? Then a Collingwood supporter leapt over the fence and offered to hold the post upright, staying in place until the game was over. The Magpies won by just 1 goal. There was a week off between rounds 16 and 17 for the 10th National Football Carnival. It was the second carnival held in Tasmania, following on from the 1924 edition, and all games were played on the North Hobart Oval. Multiple games on consecutive days with heavy rain all week resulted in a quagmire that reduced the quality of play despite the stars playing on all sides. 7 teams competed, with Tasmania, New South Wales, Queensland and a Canberra team in Section B, and the Section A competition showcasing the 3 powerhouse football states, Victoria, Western Australia and South Australia. The Vics lost their first game against Western Australia by 4 points, but beat South Australia comfortably and won the championship on percentage. Tasmania won the Section B competition and were promoted to Section A for the next carnival to be held in Brisbane in 1950. After the carnival was complete, a combined Western Australia and South Australia team defeated the Victorians by 11 points in an entertaining exhibition game. While the carnival was on, Essendon used the break to take a team bonding trip to Western Australia to play a couple of exhibition games over in Perth. While they caught the train from Melbourne, making the traditional long trip across the Nullarbor from Adelaide, they flew back from Perth to dramatically reduce the time for the trip home. While individuals or small groups of players had flown to get to games, it seems the Bombers were the first VFL club to fly as an entire team, which is appropriate given their nickname. The Western Australian state team had also flown to and from Hobart via Melbourne as post-war commercial air travel started to help sporting teams move around our very large country. Going into round 18 with just 2 games to go, Richmond was still trying to break into the top 4. They were 5th, a game behind Fitzroy and a game and a half behind Collingwood. They thrashed third-place Collingwood at Punt Road to keep their chances alive, while Fitzroy held off a determined South Melbourne to move into 3rd spot. Round 19, the last one for the season, was full of possibilities for the finals, and there was one other game that had no impact on September action, but created a record that still stands today. We'll start with the St Kilda-Melbourne game. It attracted just 6,000 people to the Junction Oval, and they would all have a tale to tell by the end of the day. Melbourne's season had not matched their grand final appearance of the year before, so they wanted to play for pride. St Kilda were once again last on the ladder, and even if they won, they would still collect their second wooden spoon in the last 3 seasons. What could be decided today was the leading goal kicker for the season. Melbourne's Fred Fanning led Geelong's Lindsay White and Footscray's Bill Wood. All were playing their last game of the season. However, Wood had once kicked 28 goals for South Sydney in a game against Sydney Naval up in New South Wales, so he knew how to get a haul. as well as leading the league goal-kicking list for the season, if Fanning kicked 10 goals, he would set a new club record for Melbourne, overtaking captain Norm Smith's effort of 89. Norm Smith was not really fit. He'd had an injury-prone season, but he persuaded the selection committee to let him play. He wanted to help Fanning break his own record. That was the Norm Smith way. As the Melbourne players ran out onto the Junction Oval, Fanning said to Don Cordner, "I'm going to kick 18 goals today." Cordner did not think much of it, but Fanning was on a mission. He kicked the team's first 4 goals and then added 7 more to have 11 goals by half-time. Smith had been sending magnificent passes straight down Fanning's throat. Once Fanning had the club record, the captain hobbled off the ground. He was done for the day, but Fanning wasn't. St Kilda's captain coach, Alan Hurd Sr., demanded his players mark Fanning more closely, but it did no good. He got another 3 goals and his first behind for the day, from a set shot 15 yards out, directly in front. Three-quarter time presented a tantalising opportunity. Fanning was on 14 goals. The club record was his. The leading goal scorer for the season was safe. However, in 51 seasons of VFL football, only 2 men had kicked more than 14 goals in a game. South's Bob Pratt kicked 15 against Essendon in 1933, and Collingwood's Gordon Coventry booted 15 goals against Essendon in 1933, 16 against Hawthorn in 1929, and 17 against Fitzroy in 1930. Coventry was very useful in front of goal. Melbourne were winning easily, and all the Demon players wanted to do was get the ball to Fanning. Even if they were in the goal square, they would stop and try and pass to their teammate. Fred kicked another 4 goals to reach his prediction of 18 for the day. It gave him 97 for the season, 411 goals in a 104-game career. The record day out was also his last game for Melbourne. Fanning would move to the country in 1948 for a higher-paying captain-coach position, earning much more than he would ever get under the Coulter rules of the VFL. It would become a bit of a saga, which we can address in the next episode, but not all Melbourne players were sad to see him go. Unlike Norm Smith, who was always happy to pass if somebody else could get the goal, Fanning was considered by some to be a selfish player. As Don Cordner once said, he could be a match winner or a match loser. The 93-point loss for St Kilda was also Alan Hurd's last game as St Kilda captain-coach. He would return to the Bombers to coach the Essendon reserves team, and his son, Alan Jr., would play 4 games for Essendon, and his grandson, James Hurd, played a bit more than 4 games in his successful career. For the teams competing in the finals, round 19 could deliver a number of outcomes. Carlton was safe in top spot, and that situation might have made them relax a bit more than they should have, and they did rest some injured players when they travelled to Geelong. The Cats kicked 7 goals in the last quarter to defeat the Blues by 2 points. Essendon was a game ahead of Fitzroy, and their percentages were about the same. The Maroons thrashed Footscray, but they had to wait for the Essendon-Collingwood result to come in to see if they had been able to pinch second spot and the all-important double chance. Collingwood were 4th, a half a game ahead of Richmond. If they won, they played finals. If they lost, they risked being replaced by the Tigers. Richmond was playing south. They pulled ahead in the second half, but everything depended on the game at Victoria Park between Essendon and Collingwood. The Magpies were in front all day. Finals bound, it seemed, until late in time on in the 4th quarter. The Bombers kicked 2 quick goals to take the lead and win the game. Essendon would keep second spot. Fitzroy would stay 3rd, and Richmond knew late in their 4th quarter, as supporters ran onto the ground to share the news, they had replaced Collingwood in the finals. For the 3rd season in a row, in their last game of the season, Collingwood had been overrun in the 4th quarter. It happened in the 1945 and 46 preliminary finals, where they surrendered good leads, and it had happened again in round 19, tipping them out of the 1947 finals. Bill Toomey said later, "It was probably a fitness thing. We just weren't as fit as we could be." Veteran coach Jock McHale had been in charge at Victoria Park since 1912, before the First World War, before the Depression, before the Second World War. McHale had begun his playing career the very same year the Wright brothers flew the first airplane. Now, football teams were flying around the country. McHale had coached the club to 8 premierships, but now younger coaches at other clubs were using newer techniques. Fitness was much more of a focus, and McHale was not one for changing his ways. So Carlton were on top of the ladder, followed by Essendon. Third and fourth were Fitzroy and Richmond. The top 4 teams in 1947 were the last 4 premiership teams, which is a demonstration of the strength of these clubs, but did raise a question of whether the league was out of balance, with the less successful clubs locked out of the potential for improvement. Or you could point to the fact that only one of the 1946 Final Four, Essendon, was playing in the 1947 finals, so maybe everything was okay. Collingwood were recipients of the very rare Gold or Mostis Award for just missing the finals after being in the 4 all season until the very last minutes of round 19. A frustrating result for the Magpies and all their supporters. Melbourne had played in the 1946 Grand Final, but a mid-season slump cost them dearly and they finished the year 6th. Geelong was heading in the other direction. Since their return to the VFL in 1944, after a 2-season break because of the war, they had finished 12th, 11th and 10th, winning a total of 7 games across the 3 seasons. Now the Cats had risen to 7th on the ladder and won 11 games, beating Richmond and Carlton late in the season. 2 more wins would have had them playing finals. The youngsters from Cardinia Park were developing into something. 2 seasons ago, South Melbourne had played in a notorious grand final against ladder leader Carlton, but while the Blues were back in the finals, the Swans were struggling. 10 wins and a draw had them 8th. Footscray had changed coaches and started the season full of confidence, second on the ladder after round 7, and then it all seemed to go wrong. They won just 3 more games for the season and were 9th, a disappointing drop from playing finals the year before. North Melbourne had been through a few good seasons, but were back to sadly familiar territory in 1947 with just 4 wins, finishing 10th. Hawthorn also had 4 wins for the season, finishing 11th, and St Kilda, after just 1 win and a draw, again had to accept another unwanted wooden spoon. The Brownlow votes were counted on the Wednesday after the end of the home and away season by the Permits Committee. After the 3 and 2 votes were counted, St Kilda's Harold Bray was in front. Then Carlton's Bert Deacon picked up a 1 vote in 5 separate games, while Harold did not add to his total. Bert Deacon's consistent form at centre-half back across the season won him the 1947 Brownlow with 23 votes. He was Carlton's first Brownlow winner. Bert was at home with his wife, baby son, and a couple of friends when they heard the news flash on the radio. The house soon filled up with more friends and family. Sandwiches were made, beers opened, and the party celebrated as newspaper photographers took pictures and reporters collected quotes. Nothing too out of hand. There was a semi-final coming up in 10 days, and Bert had to go to work the next day as a salesman for club president Kenneth Luke's Silverware and Engraving Company. Before the week was out, he got a letter from the VFL congratulating him on the win and asking him to come into Harrison House to pick up the medal. Brownlow presentations were a bit more low-key in 1947. The Brownlow is famously for the fairest and best player, and Bert Deacon was widely considered to be one of the fairest players to ever play the game. As well as a fair player, he was celebrated for his speed, ground play, confident marking and dashing play that regularly turned defensive moments into forward attacks. He would play until 1951 when injuries forced him out of the game, though he remained closely involved with the club with various stints as a vice president, chairman of selectors and club secretary. The first semi-final was played on Saturday the 6th of September. A record crowd of 82,570 people packed the MCG. Fitzroy and Richmond had played in the 1944 Grand Final at the Junction Oval, with the Roy Boys victorious, but both teams had missed finals in the next 2 seasons. Now, playing each other for the first time on the MCG, only one could proceed to the preliminary final. Richmond had been 11th after the first 5 games, but was on a roll, having won 8 of their last 10, although Fitzroy was also in great form, winning their last 6 games straight. When they played each other during the season, both had won at home. The weather was great, but the play in the first quarter was very scrambly. The Tigers were dealt a blow in that first quarter when firebrand player Max Oppie limped off injured. Fitzroy led by just 1 point at half-time, which was due to Fitzroy's very accurate kicking and Richmond's wasteful display in front of goal. Fitzroy 7 goals 1, 43 to the Tigers 6 goals 6, 42. The Maroons built a gap in the third quarter and dominated in the last to record a comfortable win, 16 goals 7, 103 to the Tigers 11-9, 75. It had been a season that started slowly for Richmond, yet they had made it through to the finals again. However, after 2 decades of success and frequent finals appearances, they would not play finals again for another 20 years. Fitzroy could now start preparing for another preliminary final. Carlton and Essendon faced off in the second semi-final, with the winner to go straight into the grand final. 75,475 were in the MCG, and they got to see an exciting game. Essendon had the benefit of a strong wind in the first quarter, and they dominated, but with a return of 3 goals 8 to Carlton's 1 behind, could have seen the game nearly decided if the Bombers had kicked straight. Carlton had the advantage of the wind in the second quarter, and their 7 goals got them well and truly back into the game. There were many worried supporters when Brownlow medalist Bert Deacon limped off injured in the third quarter, but 20th man Ken Hands began to dominate up forward, and the Blues directed their attacks through him. At the last break, Carlton went on 9-11-65, trailing Essendon 10 goals 14, 74. But the Blues had the wind in the final quarter. The Dons made some unusual errors to let Carlton in for a couple of goals, and they moved ahead to a match-winning lead, 14 goals 15, 99 to Essendon, 11 goals 17, 83. Not only did Essendon now have to face up to the preliminary final, they also had to deal with injuries to key players. Forward Ted Lehane broke his collarbone, while Bert Harper came off with concussion. The Blues also had some injury worries, with Bert Deacon hurting his leg and Jim Mooring breaking a finger. At least they had 2 weeks to recover. The preliminary final attracted 55,648, and while Dick Reynolds tipped the Bombers in his weekly ghost-written column to win by outmarking and outrunning Fitzroy, other observers, such as the Sporting Globe's Hector Lacey, tipped Fitzroy, although Jack Dyer and the Herald both tipped Essendon. One of the players in the Fitzroy team was Leo Monaghan, a member of the 1944 premiership team. Later that year, while serving in the army, he was injured by a bomb blast in New Guinea, shrapnel entering his thigh and his leg. He was invalided back to Australia, where the surgeon treating him said he would never play football again. In August 1947, he began training with Fitzroy and played in their last 4 games, as well as another 12 in 1948. He was just one of the many servicemen and women making their way back to their former lives and overcoming the many challenges they faced. It was another tense and exciting game in what was becoming an enthralling final series. At three-quarter time, there was only a point difference between the 2 teams, Essendon on 10 goals 8 and Fitzroy on 10 goals 9. Dick Reynolds once again lifted his team in the final quarter, and his 4 goals were critical in getting the Bombers across the line. 16 goals 13, 109 to Fitzroy, 14 goals 12, 96. However, the win by the Bombers was tempered by the news that forward Whopper Lane had broken his ribs. The Bombers would be going into the grand final with 2 of their key forwards out injured. Fitzroy's captain-coach, Fred Hewson, was not a happy man after the game. He felt they had got the raw end of many of the decisions by the umpire. Years later, Fred Hewson said that umpire Frank Spokes came to visit him at his home some days after the game and admitted that he had been a bit unfair after getting some cheek from a Fitzroy player early in the game. It did not change the result though. You can see Fred discuss the incident in a great video made for Fitzroy's 100th anniversary, available on Rhett Bartlett's retrospective YouTube channel. A trip down memory lane for all supporters, not just Fitzroy fans. Carlton were led into the grand final by their skipper Ern Henfrey, who had won over the doubters and vindicated the committee's decision to appoint him captain despite only playing those 2 games in 1944. It should not have been a surprise. Ern Henfrey had been an outstanding player since his debut for Perth as a 16-year-old in 1937. He represented Western Australia in 1939, aged just 17, and was runner-up for the Sandover Medal in 1941, losing out to that Hayden Bunton. His career was interrupted by the war, where he initially served in the Army before becoming a pilot in the RAAF, flying Catalina flying boats over the Pacific. The Blues swooped in 1943 when he was spending time in Victoria, and those 2 games convinced him that he wanted to play for Carlton after the war. The Western Australian League barred his transfer for a year, so he used that time to watch every Carlton game and analyse the VFL competition, while also training each week with Carlton. Later, in 1949, he joined a select group to play for 2 states when he was made captain of Victoria in their game against Western Australia. No state of origin rules in those days. Henfrey would win 2 Best and Fairest awards at Carlton before ending his VFL career in 1952, returning to captain-coach Perth, leading them to a drought-breaking premiership in 1955. Loyalty was key for Ern. He had several coaching offers from VFL clubs, but would not do anything to oppose the Blues. He was inducted into the Carlton Hall of Fame, the Western Australian Football League Hall of Fame, and the Australian Football Hall of Fame in 2014. One final tribute comes from another Carlton great, who also led the Blues to success. John Nichols saw Ern as a kid, and he loved to watch him play. Carlton's coach was the very experienced Percy Bentley. He had begun his VFL career playing for Richmond in 1925, taking over the captaincy in 1932 when they won the premiership, and he was the captain-coach for another premiership in 1934. However, the Tigers had another ruckman called Jack Dyer, and the club was only big enough for one of these 2 leaders. In a messy end to his time at Richmond, Bentley finished playing in 1940, and Dyer was given the captaincy and coaching roles. Bentley moved to Carlton as a non-playing coach and never returned to the Tigers. Bentley had coached the Blues to their drought-breaking premiership in 1945, and after missing the finals in 1946, they were back in the grand final. This would be his 246th game as a coach over 13 years. He had led teams to 3 premierships as captain or coach, and he was looking to add another. Dick Reynolds was back to yet another grand final as captain-coach of his Essendon team. The triple Brownlow medalist was coaching his team for the 160th time in his 257th game, so he also brought plenty of experience and knowledge, as well as his supreme ability as a player. He had led the Bombers to premierships in 1942 and 46, and now, in his 5th grand final as captain-coach, he wanted to bring another flag back to Windy Hill. The umpire was Alfred Reg Sawyer for his first and only grand final. He had umpired the first semi-final, but Frank Spokes had officiated the second semi and the preliminary final, which normally would have got him the big game. But perhaps the umpire committee agreed with Fitzroy's Fred Hewson's assessment of the umpire's performance in that game. Reg Sawyer knew the game as a player, coach and umpire. He had captain-coached South Kensington before switching to umpiring, spending time looking after reserves games and travelling to country matches. His first VFL senior game was in 1944. His day job was a boilermaker with the railways. He had been in the news earlier in the year, umpiring a Collingwood Fitzroy game at Fitzroy's Brunswick Street Oval. A spectator had, in his own words, got so carried away he could not stop until he struck the umpire. It happened after Sawyer had awarded a free kick and Carlos de Valdez had leapt the fence and punched Sawyer on the shoulder. He was fined £10. Alfred Sawyer would continue umpiring until 1950, ending his career with 105 matches, 6 finals, and this 1947 grand final as a highlight. The Bombers selection committee had a real headache when they contemplated their options. They had lost 2 of their key forwards in Lane and Lehane, and the Blues backline had conceded the fewest points of any team all season. While Bill Brittingham was the team's leading goal kicker, it was felt that they needed more experience in the forward line in such an important game. They needed a wise head and a strong body. To solve the problem, they took an audacious gamble, selecting a man who had not played all season. Jack Casson had played 149 games between 1936 and 1946 before spending this season as the playing coach of the reserves team. He was a big man. He had experience, and now he was playing in his 150th game in the 1947 grand final. The Blues had their own injury worries, and Bert Deacon and fullback Ollie Grieve had both been resting since the second semi-final. Given a special run on the Thursday night before the grand final, they both trained well and they were in the team. Jim Mooring's broken finger had not healed and he missed out, replaced by Ken Hands, who had done so well after coming off the bench in the second semi. His spot on the pine was taken by Ken Baxter, playing his first game since injuring his knee in round 14. 85,815 were at the grand final, most of them getting in early to get a decent seat. Gates were shut at 3 p.m, 15 minutes after the start of play, by the order of the health department, disappointing any late arrivals. Those who got in early were entertained by an exciting reserves grand final, with North Melbourne giving the Arden Street supporters something to cheer about, defeating Richmond by 15 points, 16 goals 13 to 14-10. It was the first premiership for North since joining the VFL. Their first seniors premiership was still many years away. This was the second season of the VFL Under-19 competition, but that premiership had been decided in the first weekend of September at Arden Street, with Melbourne's youngsters beating North Melbourne. Essendon had been tipped by the Herald and Jack Dyer in the Sun. Also the Argus, although their correspondent, Dick Reynolds, may not have been the most neutral observer. The Age predicted a Carlton win. The players lined up for the anthem as the crowd stood. Then Dick Reynolds won the toss and chose the City end. The first kick of the day was a free kick to Essendon's Jack Bennett, and the game was underway. Perhaps the best way to sum up the first quarter is to quote a line or two from the Herald's description of the game. Quote, Essendon's attack was hopeless. The Dons were having as much as the play as Carlton, but Carlton's strong and vigorous defence swept aside Essendon's weak attack. End quote. In all of their games against Carlton this season, the Bombers' inaccurate kicking had let them down. In round 5, the half-time score was Essendon 3 goals 10 to Carlton 7 straight. In the round 16 game, the Bombers kicked 4 goals 8 at half-time, and on that occasion, the Blues also matched them on 4 goals 8. In the semi-final, the half-time score was 6 goals 12 to 7-5. And now, at quarter-time, in the biggest match of the season, it was Essendon 3 goals, 7 behinds, to Carlton 4 goals straight. Essendon had 6 more scoring shots and led by just 1 point. Credit to the Blues, though, their pressure was making life very hard for Essendon forwards. In the second quarter, Bill Hutchinson got the first goal, but the Blues kicked 2 more to take the lead. The Bombers were playing well and constantly bringing the ball into their forward line, but the Blue defenders were playing superbly, absorbing the pressure and counter-attacking. When the Essendon players took shots, they continued to be wasteful. When the half-time bell rang, the scores revealed just how wasteful the Bombers had been. 8 goals, 11 behinds, 59, to Carlton 8 goals straight, 48. The Bombers had 19 scoring shots to 8, yet only led by 11 points. Early on in the third quarter, Ern Henfrey finally kicked Carlton's first behind. Bert Deacon was clearly struggling in the back line for Carlton. The captain, Ern Henfrey, took his place at centre-half back while Deacon limped to the centre. The play continued to favour Essendon, but they maintained their wasteful approach to goal. Carlton went forward fewer times, but they were far more efficient. As the third quarter continued, on what was a warm day, players began to tire and tempers began to fray. Jack Howell was knocked down in the centre of the ground, and one of the boundary umpires spoke to an Essendon player. Minutes later, a melee broke out on Essendon's half-forward line, with players going at each other with enthusiasm. The bell rang to provide some breathing space, and Essendon retained the lead, but not in a convincing manner. 10 goals, 15, 75, to the Blues. 10 goals for, 64. Carlton made a change at three-quarter time. Brownlow medalist Bert Deacon's leg was no good. He was cramping from a lack of preparation, and Ken Baxter came onto the ground. It was his 7th season, and he'd played every game up to that injury in round 14, so he brought plenty of experience with him. Essendon opened the final quarter attacking, but still kicking behinds rather than goals. It was second-year player Jack Jones who took a mark and kicked the first goal of the quarter for Essendon, and their lead was out to 13 points. Players from both sides were tiring, with the heat of the day and the intensity of the match taking its toll. Now it was Essendon's Bill Hutchinson standing up in defence. Time and time again, Bill intercepted Carlton forward moves, forcing turnovers and keeping the Bombers' narrow lead intact. But then, the Blues' Fred Davies took a mark and kicked Trawley, and Carlton were just 6 points down. Dick Reynolds moved himself into the back line, while Carlton's coach Percy Bentley and the selectors debated if Greenshields, with his fresh legs, should come on to replace Fred Stafford. Bentley said, "Keep Stafford on." Their attention was drawn to Ray Garby's wonderful snap from the boundary line for another goal to tie the scores. The cheers of the crowd turned to jeers when the all clear was not given. The goal umpire did not wave their flags. The boundary umpire, waving his white handkerchief, had finally got the field umpire's attention. The ball had gone out of bounds and had to be thrown in. Boundary umpires did not get whistles until 1955. Essendon still led by a goal. Years later, the boundary umpire confessed to Ray Garby that he was unsighted, and he was responding to the reaction of the Essendon supporters. But the man in white is always right. Essendon cleared the ball from the throw-in, but it was quickly rebounded. Carlton's Fred Davies, who had already kicked 4 goals, had a simple shot, 20 yards out, directly in front, but missed. That one behind, leaving Essendon with a 5-point lead. Now it was Carlton laying siege to their forward line, and Essendon valiantly defending. At one point, as the seconds ticked away, Dick Reynolds ran the ball out of defence, only to see his kick marked by his opposite captain, Ern Henfrey, also playing a great game, who returned it into the danger zone, and once again it was Reynolds who marked. Both captains were leading by example, doing all they could to get their team across the line. Reynolds knew there was not much time left, so he stopped, tried to soak up as much time as possible, before kicking the ball as long as he could. Once more, the ball landed into a line of Carlton players and was returned yet again. The ball was pushed over the boundary line near the behind post. The boundary umpire tossed it back over his head. The ruckman tussled, the tap to the ground, and Fred Stafford, who had been kept on the ground, made his move. Running in, picking the ball up on the bounce, his opponent, Norm MacDonald, was in hot pursuit. He'd been able to run him down all day. Stafford twisted, swung his left boot over his shoulder, and the ball went high into the air. The goal umpire moved, arched his back as he watched the ball fly over his head, and he raised 2 fingers. Fred Stafford's 22nd goal of his career in his 21st game since his debut in round 1 put Carlton in front by 1 point. Dick Reynolds went into the centre for the bounce, but it was too late. Carlton's ruckman Jack Howell thumped the ball forward, yet it was Essendon's Norm MacDonald who gathered and kicked it long to Bill Brittingham. But there was not enough time. The bell rang out across the ground, and Carlton had won the 1947 premiership by the narrowest possible margin. The first 1 point gap in a grand final since Fitzroy beat South Melbourne at the Junction Oval in 1899. The Blues straight kicking getting them the flag. 13 goals 8, 86 to Essendon's wasteful 11 goals, 19 behinds, 85. Carlton had ended the season on top of the ladder. Bert Deakin had won their first Brownlow medal. They had won the first semi-final, and now, by the narrowest margin, they had won the grand final. Ern Henfrey was voted best on ground by most observers, further enhancing that shock decision to make him the captain at the start of the season. It was a well-deserved premiership. The Bombers and Dick Reynolds' coaching style would come in for criticism, but they had lost 2 key forwards before the grand final and led the game until that last desperate shot by Fred Stafford. While they had been wasteful, it could have been a different result with just one more moment of luck. However, they would always think of this as the one that got away. And that dramatic selection of Jack Casson for his first game of the season? Well, he helped out in the ruck, kicked 1 goal, and had been useful. If the Bombers had won, he might have become a grand final legend. But clearly, picking a retired player who has spent the season in the reserves for a grand final is not the way to get a premiership, is it? Carlton coach Percy Bentley had no doubts they were the worthy winners. After the game he said, "We were undeniably the best team throughout the year and were on top for the season. At times we were 3 games ahead of the field, and yet when we came into the finals, we were not favourites." He then added, "Carlton are not a team of champions, but a team of players willing to fight on, irrespective of what the scoreboard says, and ready to battle it out for 25 minutes each quarter." That was typical of Carlton throughout the year. One last comment on the Blues captain Ern Henfrey from the Carlton 1947 annual report, which said, "In his first year of leadership, he ranks with the club's greatest skippers of the past. He earned the esteem, affection and admiration of his fellow players, as well as that of his opponents. If ever a player earned and deserved a premiership, our popular and modest captain did it in 1947, and we say to Ern Henfrey, heartfelt congratulations and thanks for a grand job, so very well done." Carlton players, wives and girlfriends went back to Princes Park on Saturday night to continue the celebrations. But things were looking gloomy when the lights went out and the room was pitched into darkness. Several volunteers tinkered with fuses and switches for 30 minutes until a young Fred Stafford stepped forward to once again save the day. In a few minutes he had the lights back on with almost as big a cheer as he got, kicking that winning goal in that last quarter. The Blues had one more game to play, heading over to Adelaide to play an exhibition game against Melbourne to raise funds for a local hospital. The Carlton players were not quite at their best after a week of celebrations, and perhaps the Melbourne lads wanted to prove a point. A win for the Demons by 40 points in front of 5,000 local fans, with Fred Fanning kicking another 6 goals. We'll leave 1947 there with just one more piece of gossip. A young bloke called John Coleman kicked 136 goals for Hastings this season. He had played in some Essendon pre-season games and, as a kid against men, did not do so well, ending up in the back pocket. He did get an invitation to go down to Essendon for training, but he played the season with Hastings. He would eventually play for Essendon, but that's for a future episode. If you've enjoyed Grand Final History, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from, and remember to follow or subscribe. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook or Twitter or Blue Sky for more Grand Final History.